Welcome, everybody, to today's Scientist Rebellion talk with guest speaker, Professor Aron. Adam is a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of California, San Diego. And for over 20 years, his highly successful career was in cognitive neuroscience until about 5 years ago when he shifted his research, his teaching, his activism towards preventing climate and ecological breakdown, running the Climate Psychology and Action Lab at the University of California. And we're very excited to have him here today to speak about his journey, his research, teaching, and activism. And Alan's session will last for about an hour 15 or so, including Q&A. And then we'll have a short talk about Scientist Rebellion, upcoming actions, how you can get involved. And we'll end with about 15 minutes of breakout rooms based on your location, so you can chat with people in your broad area. But without further ado, Adam, it's a pleasure to have you. Please take it away.
Great, thanks so much. Can you hear me okay? Thumbs up?
Yes.
Yeah, great.
Yes.
Thanks, Fabian and Julia. Julia, it's great to be here. So I have no financial conflicts of interest, right? So I thought what I'd do here is just read this out so you know what to expect today. So I was long concerned about global heating, too busy with my neuroscience career and parents to do anything. Until about 5 years ago, I got involved with the fossil fuel divestment movement at the University of California. And from then on, I just went deeper and deeper into this. And as I learned more about it, the climate crisis, climate and ecological crisis, I became more and more alarmed, to the point of shifting my teaching to be about the climate crisis, escalating my activism university to push for fossil-free energy and fossil-free finance, and shifting my research program to focus particularly on collective action. So what I plan to do here is to briefly present on these three components, right? The teaching, the activism, and the research. After each of them, I'll stop and we can have some questions about that segment and get some audience interaction. And then we'll do some exercises at the end and a bigger Q&A at the end. And really what I hope, I sort of have this conviction, probably many of you do, that, the time for sort of talking is kind of over and we really need to be acting. And so here we are talking. But I hope that towards the end of this presentation, I'm going to be presenting some avenues for collective action. Some of you actually may want to get involved in, right? Sort of connected with the research program, as you'll see. So starting out, there's the three components. We'll start with teaching. So briefly, right, and I'll stop and you can give me questions on this. So around 2018, as I got more and more alarmed about got my eyes on the IPCC report, understood how seriously grave this was, how I was just shocked really when I understood finally. I asked my chairman of my department, I was really doing neuroscience research, can I do a class on climate change? And I called it Psychology of Climate Change, and he said yes. And this was advertised, and I had 12 students, right? And they were all women, interestingly. And this was a great time. 3 of them became climate activists straight after that class, and 2 of them still are. But here, fast forward to 2022, and when I do this class now, I have about 120 each time. It could be bigger as well, reasons I'll explain. And I quickly started calling it the psychology of the climate crisis instead of this anodyne term of climate change. And here you can actually see this was just a couple of months ago, some of the students making a presentation in the class. So this has been the teaching I've done, and it should really be called the psycho-socio-political economic aspects of the climate crisis rather than the psychology of. But psychology makes up about 20–30% of it, and that's the department I'm in. Now, connected with this, I've written a book that I just got the proofs yesterday, which is a long process, kind of pleased about that. And I mention this simply to say that some of you or people may either be on the physical science side or on the social science or humanities side. A lot of people feel they can't teach about this stuff because they don't know other components. I've tried to, in this book, sort of put this together as a broad story that anybody, I think, should be able to understand. And certainly if you're any kind of, teach undergrads, you could do it from this book. That's the idea of it. And so it starts really with the background, the history of heating, the climate science, climate impacts, analysis of capitalism. And then it gets into these 2 topics. Now, okay, fine, that's the story. That's why nothing much is really happening. Things are happening, but not enough, not fast enough. What do we need to do? We need to shift more people to believe we have a problem, which is sort of part 2. And then what is it we need to do? We need to move people to action. Well, what kinds of actions do we need? So that's it on the teaching. And I'm going to pause now and open up for questions. Anything people want to ask me about this process, I'm happy to try and answer. questions about the teaching?
I have a question. I guess I'm
David,
curious.
oops, sorry. Maybe Fabienne, can you moderate this because I can't see everybody?
Yes, absolutely. Please just unmute yourself or raise your hand so we can have. Go ahead, Sangyuk.
Yeah, no, just a quick question and about the dramatic increase in the student interest between 2019 and 2022, and obviously, you know, I'm guessing. I guess what are your thoughts and insights about the change?
So, you know, it's a dilemma I face, right? Because when there were 12 students, or if there would be like 20, then we can really get into it and have serious discussions. Whereas if the class gets bigger, particularly if it goes over 200 or something, then you're now forced to do multiple choice, and this is not really the kind of education you want. On the other hand, you want to reach more students. So many students at UCSD has 30,000 undergrads. And many of them are getting classes that have something to do with climate change, but they're getting like the physics and the atmospheric chemistry, or they're getting something in ethnic studies that's about climate justice. But they're not getting this broad kind of perspective. And this class goes into geoengineering and carbon capture and natural gas and fracking and renewable energy and social movements. And, you know, it's got all of the stuff in there. And so, the reason there's 120 is because it's got known and people are excited to take it, but it, you know, it's kind of surprising to me it's only 120. I should think, you know, 500 students want to take this class, right? And the reason is it's not a major, it's not part of a major, it's not a requirement anywhere. And I have to put the class at 5 p.m. to be able to get enough students in it because most of them are busy taking other classes. So this now connects with collective action, because what we've managed to do, as I'll explain in a little bit, is generate a campaign. The climate movement at UCSD, the grassroots, have generated a campaign to demand climate justice education for 30,000 undergrads. And now that is on the cards. So there's going to be a huge upscaling now that every student needs to be taking a class. We hope a class that has this kind of centering of the socio-political economic aspect, in which case my class would be a lot bigger. But I hope a lot more professors would start teaching this stuff in answer to your question. I think David.
Nice. Yes, David has his hand up, and then there are 2 questions in the chat. Go ahead, David. David, you might be muted.
David, just
sorry. Just checking to see how much in your principles for just and effective action you consider the examples of Gandhi and King.
Yeah, well, that's more the chapter 10 part, building and taking collective action. So yes, and in the class, I certainly try to, I've done a bit of a dive into the history of social movements and collective action. So yes, Gandhi and King come up, absolutely. I mean, the central problem we face, and I will get to that as I move through this, is we need to build a mass social mobilization, right? That's what planet Earth needs. And as you all know, it is tiny, it's minuscule, it's a tiny fraction of people in the climate movements compared to any of those previous struggles, right? So why? And how do we grow it? And so yes, David, we need to learn from those principles and prior organizing. Looking at the chat, Anna says, how is the rest of your department, faculty, university receive the course? Any resistance? Good question. So, I wouldn't say there's resistance of any kind. I'm disappointed at how much I've been on my own doing this. Let me say, like there's very little support. The only support there's been is from my department chairman saying, yeah, you can do this now. You can stop doing your neuroscience teaching and you can teach this stuff. Yeah, that was huge, right? I mean, if he'd given me, if he'd blocked me, I would have had to do, you know, I don't know what I would have done. I would have had to really push against him, right? So I've been given that kind of support, but otherwise I'm being left on my own. Like I would have thought an institution that has the Scripps Institution of Oceanography that has made major discoveries in global heating would be excited that there's a class like this, but people are in their silos. So how is my department? My department, you know, this is something to discuss later, and there may be other questions about this. I'm very much on my own right now, right? So there's 32 faculty at UC San Diego Psychology, and I'm one of them, and I'm the only one that, as far as I can tell right now, is doing anything about this, teaching, research, activism at all, out of 32, right? So I'm kind of an outlier, and I have to kind of be brave about that, I guess is the answer. Renata, if I'm pronouncing your name right, says, what is the reaction of your colleagues been, or teaching staff from other areas following suit? The reaction of I don't know what the reaction is of my colleagues in my department. They just let me do my thing, I think. Maybe they think I'm crazy. I don't know. I think they're crazy. I think they need to wake the fuck up, obviously, right? But across the campus, maybe I'll defer answering that question now because you'll see what we've achieved in the grassroots climate movement. And I think clearly we've been able to push the whole institution to start dealing with it. So it's very encouraging, is basically the answer. The wider picture is very encouraging. Yeah, there's a question here. There's a hand up from Frederick.
Yeah, thanks. Regarding strategy, did you have a strategy for the case you would have been not allowed to do this course? And what's your strategy to get this course, yeah, for all students? Yeah.
So to get a strategy to scale up this kind of education, I'll speak to later as part of the climate activism. The first part is, what would my strategy have been if I'd been blocked? That's a good question. I didn't face that, so I haven't thought about it a whole bunch, but I think I would have, I mean, I guess most of you are in university settings, it varies by, I mean, I think if you were a professor or a postdoc or a lecturer in organic chemistry and they hired you to teach organic chemistry, it would be a very clear understanding that organic chemistry is what you do. Like, to say I wanted to teach the psychology of climate change right now, that would be impossible. Of course, you could find ways through organic chemistry of building in your concern about the climate crisis by teaching a lot of, I mean, you could find a lot of examples, but it would be primarily about chemistry and not about the climate crisis. I happen to be in a psychology department, so, you know, in some ways this is definitely about human behavior and human society, and so it's easier for me to make that shift. I think if the chairman had opposed me, it's hard to imagine that happening in my university really at that level. We have a very cushy, privileged setup here as professors. If he'd opposed me, I would have brought the force of collective action to bear on him to a maximum, right? I would have had petitions with the students. I would have got the grad students behind me. I would have gone to the EVC and the deans. I would have made a real fuss. And, you know, yes, that's what I would have done. And so Hannah says, any tips for us to have access to students who don't have the possibility to craft type course? How do we? This is a great question. So we're going to have basically 30,000 undergrads taking some kind of climate education at UCSD. We've succeeded in pushing that to happen. One option is a class like this, where the whole class is sort of the full picture, which is going to be rare, and few people are going to want to do that, and not all the students are going to get a class like that. And not everyone agrees this is the right way to do it. The alternative is to what's called teach through the curriculum, right? So if you're in a biology department, you teach biology, but you embed enough examples of soil site sequestration and forestation. I mean, there's many examples of which biology is relevant to the climate ecological crisis. So you bury in an academically relevant way. That is another way to do it. That's kind of a big topic I can't answer briefly. And I think there's a hand up here from Avi.
Hi, Adam. Yeah, I guess, do you have a section about, you know, people's perceptions towards, you know, climate despair and aspects of, you know, feeling helpless, and then how this sort of feeds into, you know, human psychology, and how to gather effective tools to then, you know, escape that and then actually be a part of the fight? Great question. So the way the class has been organized is kind of like the book, and the problem with this right now is that it's so heavy on the front. There's actually a student here, Pauline, who took the class. It's so, students are hit with so much stuff. If you look at 1, 2, 3, 4, they're like, oh my God, we're on RCP 8.5. Look at the impacts, look what's happening to the Indian heat wave. Then they have to wait all the way down to number 10 to actually get excited about what we can do. So I'm going to try and put that stuff earlier. But to answer your question, one thing I found out is actually chapter 7 talks about elevating risks. I talk frankly about eco-anxiety, climate anxiety, solastalgia, radical hope, all this kind of stuff. And I bring someone who's better than me, who's more emotionally intelligent than I am. I bring someone who can talk to the students about how they feel. This is actually a great thing. They sort of are able to kind of share with each other their feelings of anxiety and dread. But I think the way to deal with that, and the antidote to that, is to center the role of collective action and social mobilization, which is happening around the world. I mean, there's great examples of headway being made.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next section now. All right, so activism. So what do we need to do? I was going to ask you all what we need to do, but in the interest of time, I'll tell you what I think we need to do, which is we need to stop all new fossil infrastructure. That is clear. That was clear from the IPCC 2018 or before. It's clear even from the IEA, the International Energy Agency, which has basically been a mouthpiece for fossil fuels forever. They're saying there should be no new extraction after 2025. We should retire existing infrastructure. That's not much talked about, but obviously that's what we need to do as well, even with lost value. And so that's a huge problem for an institution like mine that is emitting 200,000 tons a year of carbon dioxide burning fossil gas. And they've got this huge fossil plant on campus that they basically have a mortgage on until the 2030s. You're basically saying you need to come up with money to retire that thing. We need to contest fossil fuel interests everywhere, right? Including in academia. But that's not enough. We also, of course, need a fast renewable energy buildup. These are necessary things, but not sufficient, because we need to contend with extractivism, i.e. the perpetuation of particularly corporations in global north extracting from global south in a way that doesn't honor or share the wealth with local people there and recapitulates these horrible dynamics that got us into the problem in the first place. And we need consumption reduction. Obviously, don't have time to talk about these things. And yet my conviction is, and I think it's pretty obvious, right? None of this is happening. It's going to happen fast enough without a large social mobilization. The politicians, be they Trudeau or Schultz or wherever you're situated in the world, or Modi, or even here, is going to have, none of this is going to happen without a large social mobilization to impel decision makers to do it, including in the institutions we're in, such as mine, right? So we got together in 2019, we formed a grassroots collective action group at UC San Diego, and I have a 1-minute video to show you about this, so you can just check this out. Okay, so that is the formation of the UCSD Green New Deal, which I'll talk a bit about as we go along. It always makes me emotional to see this movie, by the way, because it's, you know, it's a testament to what a small group of people can actually accomplish, as you will see. So I'm in UC San Diego, and there are 9 other campuses in the UC system. Now, what I have to say here, you know, applies very well to most large American universities, but in Europe, you're not typically burning fossil gas on your campus for electricity production, but you often are for heating, okay? But even if it's not exactly the same, you have the same banking, you have the same divestment issues, you have the same fossil money in research, so many of these things apply everywhere. I happen to be situated in a very large university system, and that's a great target for activism. But even if your system is small, or your institution or your research institute or wherever you are is small, it's still something that can and should be done. So one of the major issues is we need fossil-free energy where we are, in our cities, in our institutions, in our universities, wherever we're situated. If you work in a hospital, same thing. And so where does your electricity come from? Well, in the UC system, it comes from burning frac methane fossil gas, right? Often given this moniker natural gas, which people think is a wonderful thing often. It's a form of greenwashing, that name. And we're emitting 1 million tons a year of carbon dioxide from burning fossil gas on the campus, not even counting transportation. It's just mind-blowing. I mean, everyone thinks of California as the forefront of environmental action, which to some extent is. But this is one of the most progressive institutions in the United States, burning fossil gas at a massive level. Finance. There's issues of pension and endowment and how it's invested. There's banking, which is commercial banking, and retail. Retail is the banks you use as an individual, commercial is the banks that the institution uses. There's issues of insurance, And there's funding for research, like a lot of fossil dollars in Stanford, Harvard. Ben Frank has documented this fantastically, the insidious influence of fossil dollars on universities and on research, particularly earth science, and often even energy research. So many of you may know this, but if you don't, there's the Banking on Climate Chaos report, which is fantastic, Rainforest Action Network, and it documents the complicity of the main banks. And I only put the top 4 here, but Deutsche Bank, for example, and some of the European banks are like 8, 9, 10 below, okay? So together, JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America have financed fossil extraction to the tune of over $1 trillion since the Paris Accords. So this is what Bill McKibben calls stopping the money pipeline, right? Ideally, we would have enough social power to actually compel our decision makers to crush the fossil fuel industry, to actually drive it into the ground and ban it. That ain't going to happen anywhere soon. Maybe in Quebec and Los Angeles, they've been able to stop new extraction, but that's not the same as crushing the industry. So that's not really happening now, but another way to do it is to starve it of the money, right? That's stopping the money pipeline. And one way to do that is to put pressure on the banks. Now, in the UC system, our operating budget is $40 billion a year, which is just mind-blowing. Like, this is the 2nd largest employer in the 5th biggest economy in the world. This is one of the biggest institutions in the world. And I'm sad to say, as of right now, still, it's the case that almost all of that $40 billion per year passes through Wells Fargo and Bank of America, which are 3 and 4 of like the worst banks in the world. So we are literally complicit in financing fossil extraction, right? And there's other issues. You can focus on food waste. We're emitting about 16,000 tons a year of carbon dioxide equivalent from our decomposing food waste at one university, just because it's dumped in the hole in the ground. And issues of teaching, transportation, aviation. So there's many things you can focus on if you're interested in doing campaigns. So I'm just briefly going to tell you quite quickly now about a few of the wins or interim wins or things we've succeeded in that should make you feel excited about collective action. So it can make me feel grateful and proud of what we've done, right? So fossil gas burning on campus is a long story. If you're interested, you can look at electrifyuc.org, which tells the sort of history of where we've come with this. Petitions, campaigns on the side of the road, UCSD burns frac methane, raising consciousness. This is the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. We did sand writing, UCSD stopped burning frac methane. This was a massive hit on social media, this pic, by the way. Getting out consciousness, raising people's awareness to the point where our allies were able to get members of our org, these 4 young women here, in front of the main decision makers of the university system that represents over 400,000 people. So here is the chief financial officer of the whole thing. Here's the most powerful person, the chair of the regents, listening attentively. And here's our chancellor listening to the fact that we've got to stop burning fossil gas. He doesn't look pleased, but his posture tells us everything we need to know. The gig is up for him, right? He has to deal with this now. So all of this led, there's various ways that this is manifested. It's kind of a long story to tell, but one thing it led to was a vote, okay? By all the faculty in the UC system, so about 12,000 of them on the 10 campuses, basically got to vote on the following proposition. The UC Academic Senate, i.e. the faculty governing body, petitions the regents, the powerful people who control the university, for investments in infrastructure that will reduce on-campus fossil combustion by at least 60% by current levels by 2030 and 95% by 2035. The 60% was not what we hoped for. It got watered down to some extent by faculty who are funded by fossil interests getting into this process, by the way, just to be clear. But still, this is a fantastic resolution. This is our situation here. Frac methane comes from the Central Valley and other states. It comes in a pipeline to our campus. It's burnt in the Central Utilities plant, generating loads of carbon dioxide. And this is what we need, right? We need to plug into the California grid, by the way, which on a sunny day like today is generating so much electricity from solar right now, they're having to waste a lot of it. It generates over 110% of electricity needs during the day. So there's many ways you can plug into the grid. So I'm happy to say that faculty voted. Not enough of them bothered voting, by the way, only at about the 21% level. They couldn't even click an email to open it after everything we did. But of those who did vote, 85% said yes, yes. Good, okay, so we can use that now. So this campaign, for reasons I can't explain to you, because it's a long story, is the direct consequence of grassroots agitation over a couple of years period, okay? And so now the whole 10 campus system has allocated over $10 million now to make electrification plans. Berkeley is actually determined that it's raising got 300 million from the state. It's actually going to retire its fossil generation plant and go basically carbon free by 2028. So the process is out the door. I'm not saying it's won by any means, but the shifting of goals and the shifting of hearts and minds is a certain kind of power that the grassroots has. Okay, retail banking.
We need you to move the money. Hey, Chase, this ain't funny. We need you to move the money. Chase Bank, you know how. Stop funding pipelines now.
So this is, banking is complicated. There's many components. There's commercial and retail. This is really retail. This is Chase Bank on our campus in the student center. And there's Pauline, who's actually here today. We kicked up such a fuss over such a long period of time, repeatedly doing this kind of thing, that it contributed to the decision to kick out Chase Bank. Goodbye, Chase Bank. I won't say it's only because of what we did that Chase left. There were other things the university took into consideration, but this is a win, right? This is the kind of thing that could and should be done everywhere. All right, so investment, really, we never, even though the UC went further perhaps than any other institution, pretty much, maybe Oxford, I don't know what's quite up with the UK university. A lot of institutions that claim they've done divestment, they haven't divested at all. They've got goals in 2050, Harvard, Columbia, even Middlebury College and McKibben, 2035. And it's not divestment, even at the UC. They'll never admit to divestment. Divestment is a moral position. They call it de-risking. The chief financial officers were de-risking our assets, which means they could buy them back, by the way. But anyway, we've definitely made progress here, and I'm happy to say here is some evidence for it. So the entire default pension plan for all faculty and staff is now basically had all of its fossil owning stocks sold. So as of Friday, the June 3rd, UC literally stole $900 million of stocks of fossil extraction companies in the default pension plan. This is amazing, right? So these are the kinds of things that have been accomplished. And here is demand number one: teach climate crisis and justice to all. This is now in principle accepted by my university, and the way of implementing that is being worked out. So we're going to have climate education for 50,000 undergrads in 1 or 2 years. What exactly that looked like and how you actually do that, I'm not sure, but this is a sort of impressive thing. So brief evaluation here. The very good is that a small group of people, we're talking about at its core 10 or 20 people maybe, with a penumbra of 30 or 40 supporters, can make this kind of change in an institution that's that big, okay, with allies on the other campus and so forth. The not so good is that it's still too tiny, right? It's a tiny number of people involved. If we could ramp up those numbers, then you can push a lot of the stuff forward to real implementation, like you could literally get the campuses off the gas, I think. So I'm going to pause here and take some questions about this activism part. Just looking at the chat. Question from Abi up here.
Hi, Adam. Thanks. That's very inspiring. I guess my question would be, does divestment from fossil fuels, is that ensuring that the money is not going into something that's equally polluting, right? I mean, can it be actually used as a source for social mobilization, maybe investing in schemes, let's say in India or Bangladesh or where have you, where money is actually needed to affect, people experiencing the effects of climate change?
Sure, that's a deep question, and I kind of have a lot to say about that, but we could chat offline a little bit, right? But briefly to say that, yes, that would be good. One of the things they do is they start with this ESG language, and ESG may be better than nothing, right? But mostly it's a bunch of nonsense, obviously. And so, but what's the answer? Okay, the short answer is that we need full transparency on the investments, and I think we're going to be getting those in the next few months. That's one of our demands. So they claim to have sold, $900 million of stock in fossil-owning companies. By the way, there's all sorts of other companies implicated in the fossil industry that they still invested in, but at least the ones that, it's a complicated thing, right? Because some of it's like, we don't own any slaves, but we trade in the chains. But with full transparency, Abi, we should be able to see that the $900 million they sold is invested in other things. Now, those things are probably not going to be as socially just as you're imagining, but there'll be other kinds of investments that are profitable for the university, which is understandable. It's our pensions after all. And one would need some sort of level of scrutiny to kind of guide that to be better things. But yeah, it's a complicated question and a really good one. just looking at the chat over here. So Renata says, why do you think more people are not get involved in the movement? What's missing? Well, that's a great, that's the last part of my talk, which is how do we get more collective action? So I'm going to wait on that, Renata. As a neuroscientist, what do you think of the mass psychosis formation theory employed in the COVID pandemic? I'm going to skip that question. I don't know what the mass psychosis formation is. I'd like to know more about carbon offsets. Okay, yes, great question. Francesca's asking about carbon offsets. I'd like to hear any insights. Here's California Center for Climate Justice. Okay, so offsets. So what's incredibly important to understand is that the UC system is seen as a leader everywhere in the world on climate action. And that's because they've developed this carbon neutrality initiative back in 2013 and done a fantastic marketing job everywhere in all their websites and outward-facing stuff. And they've resourced it quite a lot with sustainability offices of $4 million a year, whatever. And so a lot of people have been hoodwinked, and faculty and students, everyone's like, he's a climate leader. And if we peeled away what carbon neutrality means, which took some research and efforts from 2019, and what it basically means is offsets, right? So their plan was to keep burning fossil gas on campuses, emitting 1 million tons of carbon dioxide into the 2030s or beyond. But somehow by 2025, they're going to start kind of making good on that by buying offsets. And you could say, well, your offsets are crap, and you know, no, we're going to do the really good offsets. And so they have identified projects that meet a lot of the criteria, but there's no way those projects could scale big enough. And as you probably all realize, the offsets thing, at least my determination, is just totally morally problematic. If there is any such thing as a good project like cook stoves in Africa, where you pay for them so people don't cut down their forest to burn, instead burn these wood pellets from cuttings of lumber yards, which is a good thing for their health, any project like that that's genuinely good is going to get funded anyway on its own merits. It should never be funded instead of cutting fossil combustion, especially in the global north, right? So we need to do both, if anything. We need to fund all the good projects in the world, and we need to cut our emissions instead of pretending that we don't have to cut our emissions by doing that thing instead. So one of the great things we've accomplished with this grassroots movement is make all the decision makers and the chancellors and the whole wider edifice of the system recognize that offsets are basically a bullshit process. And now they have to actually contend with getting off the gas and electrifying the campuses. So that is a sort of win, right? The grassroots has power in changing goals. How did my colleagues, Anna, how did my colleagues take my activism? So, you know, my immediate colleagues in my department are, since this is being recorded or whatever, I need to be polite here. I mean, I think, so there's a long topic, since you're scientists, you know about a lot of this already. This is a big topic of that Wolfgang Nohr has written about, and others, of why so few academics will actually really do activism. People will strike all sorts of poses, but so few will actually get engaged. And that's a kind of a long topic that, you know, kind of a lot to be said about that. So most people are just not going to do this. And I think the younger faculty in my immediate surrounds sort of clap me on the back a little bit. It's like, this is so great, well done, you know, and they kind of get it. I think the older ones have all these ideas about, you know, you can't mix advocacy with academia. And there's actually a really nice paper I have here in front of me. How many people might want to read? It's from the journal Conservation Biology, and it's called On Advocacy by Environmental Scientists, the what, the whether, the why, and the how. This is a great paper, by the way. And they sort of dissect all the arguments given in the field of environmental science going back 100 years of why scientists feel that they shouldn't be involved in advocacy. Any hands going up? Any other questions here? We can edit the recording. All right, let me have a look here. How am I integrating this with my cognitive neuroscience research? I'm not. I'll talk a little bit about the kind of research I'm doing in a moment. I don't see a way to do that. I mean, obviously, if I thought that I could really keep doing neuroscience research and make it, so just to say, I don't think or expect that everyone would do what I did and basically drop their career and kind of start something new. That's kind of a dramatic thing to do. I felt I needed to do that. But I think people could continue doing neuroscience research or whatever kind of research that they love and might even be important sometimes, and do the stuff on the side and do the stuff at nighttime and get involved in collective action without actually changing their career trajectory. But the best for me would have been to combine these things. I didn't see a way to do it. Honestly, I don't think, unless someone wants to persuade me of this, I don't see any way that neuroscience in general, and at least of all cognitive neuroscience, really bears on this. I mean, you could put people in brain imaging machines and scan them, fear circuitry, and sort of understand what messages would elevate their risk. But we don't really need that. That's not going to help. We need people to start doing stuff. We don't need to start probing and understanding the belief architecture and things like that. Fabian, your hand's up.
Yes, this is fantastic work, and I have a question regarding to scale as well. You said there, rather few people involved locally at your campus. There's this other issue of, well, there are many campuses around the US, right? And I'm wondering whether you're kind of connecting this to other struggles in other campuses, or whether you see a way to have this be a tipping point for other campuses, or whether there's kind of, I don't know, like a ranking you could do across campuses and point to other issues. I'm wondering whether you thought about scaling these issues to other campuses, and what's the landscape there?
That's a great question. That's actually where I'm headed in the third part of this, is how to actually do that and actually get some of you involved if you're interested. So yes, okay, we need to scale it broadly. Just to say, this was a 10 campus UC initiative, right? So mainly I talked about the organization we founded at UCSD, but we tried to trigger, as part of what we did, our demand number 4, or our campaign number 4, was to build a UC-wide thing. And so we developed something called the UC Green New Deal Coalition. And so there's people at Berkeley and UCLA and Santa Cruz all around, and we were able to some extent to force all of those 10 together to speak with one voice, which was quite effective. But yes, Fabian, the question, and I think Renata and maybe Anna brought this up, like, this is too small, and we need to scale it bigger, and I'm going to talk more about that in the next section. Abi?
Yeah.
Oh, and Fabian, sorry, yes. I think universities are a great site for this kind of action. If you rewind to the 1960s, there's a fantastic film you can watch called The War at Home, which is a documentary set in Madison, Wisconsin, which tells a story of the anti-Vietnam War movement from a student's perspective. Of course, it was happening in Columbia and Paris and Berkeley. It wasn't just Madison, but Madison was a very significant site for this. And you have to realize, I mean, okay, those middle class, particularly white boys, didn't want to get exported to Indochina and blown up in the jungle. So there was an element of self-preservation. But of course, the anti-war movement became much more than that. I mean, thousands and thousands of students at that one campus alone over years. They occupied administration buildings. They burnt down the ROTC. They went after Dow Chemicals, which was making napalm. I mean, there was a level of radicalization over that issue. Now we're facing something much more dramatic than the Vietnam War, by the way. This is, as you recognize, going to disrupt organized existence in a matter of decades. I mean, we have 30,000 undergrads at UCSD. We do a rally. Not everyone wants to protest, by the way, but if we can get 200 or 300 people at a rally, we're doing well. It's like this is a wide issue throughout, I can tell, American academia. I don't know what it's like in Europe particularly. UK seems a little different, seems a little further ahead maybe, but the number of people who are prepared to step up and get engaged is absolutely minuscule. So that's what the next part is about. Abi, your hand is up.
Yeah, I guess like you, I used to be a neuroscientist, and I left academia to work in climate, sustainable agriculture. But I guess my question is sort of, how can someone who's no longer affiliated with the academic system as such, but still has a scientific mindset, what are the avenues for getting into this kind of activism? How can one, how can one push it to the maximum, let's say?
Are you asking, you're not officially attached to a university now, but you come from that setting and you want to somehow be involved?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Sounds like you and I should talk offline. I have a bunch of thoughts on that. Renata, you gave up your previous career. What's your official job? Well, so I gave up. I've quit my neuroscience career and research trajectory, but I still am a professor in the psychology department. And so, I still have my job, Renata. And so I've sort of redirected my efforts, and that's what I'll be talking about next. It's a good question, though. What else? What else? Okay, how are we doing on time? Okay, I'm going to move on. All right, now research. So, what do we need, right? We need a bigger social mobilization, and not just in universities, obviously. And so I would say, and by the way, like, it's good news what's happening in the US Senate and Congress now. I mean, this is a big deal, right? $400 billion. It's like a shot in the arm for renewable energy. We're happy about this. This arose through myriad efforts over a decade by climate justice and climate orgs and Bernie Sanders and AOC and the Sunrise Movement and all of this, and pressure on Schumer from his own staff. There's a lot of collective action behind this. That bill is not enough. It's like annualized 5% of the military budget. And of course, it's full of these poison pills that basically bolster and increase the fossil industry. So it's not enough, right? This is not over, but it's obviously a good thing that's happened. So my view is, and this is about theory of change, right? And you guys wouldn't be here if you didn't share this theory of change. Like many other academics and science professors, that's a complete waste of time what you're doing, Adam, because China's emitting so much. You'll hear that all the time. It doesn't even matter what UC does. It doesn't even matter what California does. It doesn't even matter what the US does because China's emitting so much. People come up with all sorts of reasons to not get engaged in these discourses of climate delay. So we instead share this view that local action really matters. And if we start acting where we are in our institutions, in our cities, in our towns, in our states, ultimately that does become national action. And there's very good historical reasons to think that that works that way, going back to the Nixon administration, civil rights. It's the $15 minimum wage. You have examples of that in Germany and France and everywhere else too. So we need this local thing. And for me, it means at the school district, at the city hall, at the regional level, San Diego's county, the state level, California. We need all of these kinds of actions and policies and bills that are lined up to move forward. Okay, for example, we need all buildings electrified going forward. There should be no building put up that has a natural gas line. They're still doing that right now, by the way. We need to guarantee that rooftop solar stays there instead of being, there's a real prospect right now that rooftop solar is going to be killed in California because the fossil fuel industry is so powerful, right? So there's incredible bills and policies lined up in Sacramento that are being blocked, often by Democrats who are supported by the fossil fuel industry. So why? Why are all these things being blocked? And so just, there's no reason to be skeptical about democracy in the sense. If I focus, for example, on the state of California, the politicians in Sacramento, to a large extent, do what the voters want, no doubt. Just not enough voters care about this or are getting together and making their voices heard at the right time in the right place. It's tiny evidence. Here is the day before an absolutely momentous decision was made in San Diego. Okay, this was a couple of years ago during the pandemic. The city council had the board of supervisors had to vote on whether or not to renew basically a 20-year contract with a fossil fuel subsidiary to control our electricity utility. A for-profit subsidiary of Sempra Energy was basically controlling our whole electricity thing for a city of 1.8 million. And yes, the climate activists boldly fought this for a long time. They got the media on their side. You can see us out there, about 100 people the day before the city council votes. Yes, probably a few hundred people, maybe 1,000 people wrote in letters, called. But in the end, when push comes to shove, out of a city population of 1.8 and a county population of 3.5 million, there's 80 people out there. Bearing in mind, protest is only one thing, and that's not all that counts. And it went through. They voted 6-3 that basically we continue the franchise deal. We could have had public power. We could have wrested control of the whole apparatus into public power and created low rates for the population. Now, on the other side were unions and all kinds of moneyed interests, but this is evidence for me that on momentous decisions like this, where this absolutely concerns the climate crisis and people's well-being, just too few people turn up and understand what it is they need to do at a particular moment, right? So what do we need to do to get this broader social mobilization? So this kind of connects with my class and how I kind of lay it out. And so I think to get the broader social mobilization, there's I would simplistically two main categories. You need more of the skeptics to move to belief, including belief about how serious the predicament is. And we need more of the believers to move to action. So in the US population, you have about 57% to the state were last measured last year, accept the human cause. Of those that accept the human cause, not all of them accept the impacts are here, or the impacts are going to be bad. So you still have impact skeptics, right? Some of the right wing are impact skeptics, even though very few of them, for Congress, for example, will be skeptics now about the human cause. And even if you accept the impacts are bad and are going to get very bad, and we're going to elicit $23 trillion of damages per year by 2050, according to Swiss Re, you may, and this characterizes many people, be skeptic that there's anything you can do as an individual or a city or a nation. And of course, then you might accept, you may overcome your response skepticism and accept the human cause and the impact, and that you need to do something. And then, of course, this characterizes most of the people we know, and I don't say that to be mean. You'll get involved in a little bit of action. If you're a professor here in California, you'll start driving an electric car and you put solar panels on your roof, and you'll feel good for it. And I suppose that's okay, but that's not enough. So those who really take this more seriously are going to move to personal and collective action, look at it, grieve, talk about it, make personal changes, advocate institutions, join grassroots activism, pressure elected officials. Some will go to civil disobedience. And there's myriad things you can do that are collective, and everyone should really be doing that in all their career spaces. Okay, so when in our new climate psychology and action lab, that answered Renata's question, right? So I've sort of shed the neuroscience part, and I've kind of built up this new lab in the psychology department, which has got a few people in it. We have a number of different research studies directed at various points in this diagram. For example, we're doing one on how to elevate risk perception. I mean, part of the problem, there's many reasons why people aren't taking this seriously and acting. And one of those reasons is too few people actually understand how serious this is, right? People, for example, lived through the Pacific Northwest heat wave, got a nasty shock, right? 1,000 people died, and they're like, shit, it was being hot for 4 days. And then it kind of goes away. What they don't understand is that that frequency intensity is going to increase even with the degree of heating. So we're trying to understand, how do you communicate science in a way that really freaks people out, right? I mean, it's one thing one can do. But I think the thing that really matters is collective action. And I feel like my endeavors shouldn't really be on the research for its own sake, but the research in the sense that the research is coupled to getting this wider social mobilization. So I'm going to pause here and invite Julia and Fabian to create a little breakout room exercise for you, where you're going to be assigned to rooms of about 6 per room. And I'd like you to talk to whoever you meet there briefly, just for 5 minutes, about how you would go about organizing collective action. Okay, and I'll give you a specific example. Imagine your goal is to shift the personal, so you're in a university or a hospital. You want to maximize the number of people who actually take their money out of the bad banks and put it, for example, in a credit union. So by the way, here, credit unions have almost no exposure to the fossil industry. How would you perform collective action to maximize that happening? That's your just brainstorm projects. Like, how, if you sat together as a group to try and make that happen, what would you actually do? How would you go about doing it? And then if you could choose a spokesperson who could briefly report back, that would be great.
I joined late. Derry did. You did a lot of the talking and focusing on spectacle. I'm not sure whether you want to briefly report back to everybody.
No, I just private message you that you should be our spokesperson. See, this is the problem, is no one wants to be out there. So one thing, I'll just share what our little climate group has planned. We don't have a Chase Bank on campus, but we have kiosks. So we think anything that gets people to pay attention and raises the conversation about something on campus is a good idea. And then Abby, you have to jump in with what you were talking about before I even arrived. So we're going to put little out of order sign, sticker tape around the Chase and Wells Fargo kiosks, and then hang from them the information about the fossil fuel funding that they do. And then we're going to invite up to campus the local credit union, which does good things with its money. So yes, basically spectacle. And then Abby asked, well, what about if you're not on campus? And then I was describing the various XR style spectacle actions that had taken place in the town of Santa Cruz, at the Wells Fargo and at the Chase banks, to again call attention to the general public who may not know, who I'm sure don't know, just that there is this problem. So it's all about what Adam was talking about raising the level of conversation, getting a higher percentage of people A, aware, B, motivated, and C, actually involved. All right, Abby, back to you.
I think you covered it extremely well there. I mean, I think basically what I was trying to maybe talk about was, I think, the presentation of information, but in a way that's relatable to people, which you were saying, and having this sort of spectacle, having maybe a visual aids, having these, the tape and whatnot. I think those are all excellent tools to use, and it was really great to hear how you and your team enacted that and on the campus. But yeah, I mean, it's also, I guess, it's presenting all of this information in a way that's not too overwhelming, I suppose, and then also offering it with humor, as you also mentioned, and then having a way to offer an alternative, in which I guess in this case was the credit unions.
Other ideas? Anyone want to share? So one of the challenges with this kind of thing is you need a feedback loop, right? So most people are like they don't care enough about the climate crisis really to be motivated to put all in, but most people care to some extent and they want to do right. So they feel as if, oh, okay, if I shift my personal banking, who cares? It's minuscule. I only have $300 there. I'm not even going to bother. You have to make people feel a dynamic social norm, right? People have to kind of get this idea that if I do it and my friend does it and 1,000 people do it, and 15% of all the students in the UC system, which would be 15% of 250,000 did it, that actually is going to start affecting the banks. So you have to kind of make people feel like it's a growing norm. And how would one do that? How would people feel that it was growing, that they were part of something growing? Is there some way to make that happen? Well, I don't fully know the answer myself, but I think we have a lot of computer science savvy people and tech savvy people here. You need to potentially gamify it in some way, right? Frederick, do you have an idea?
Yeah, that's the idea I had, to make a online event or something out of it, where everybody can dial in how much money he divested now, and then can see how much money was divested in total and who participated. Yeah.
Thinking this through, right? I think it's a potentially fantastic campaign one could develop if you could kind of create competition between different campuses or different students or different colleges. If people have it it's turned into a game in a way on the phone, like how many friends can you get to do this and what's the total amount? And this gets reflected in ongoing data that's growing. And then it becomes TikTok and social media. It's like, I haven't seen anything like that, but it doesn't seem that hard if like one really set around to doing this. Okay, anyway, these are great ideas to think about, just to think about how to do collective action. So in the little bit of time that's left here, I'm going to tell you a little bit in the research part. So we're doing a number of research studies. So one of the really important questions, this is being touched on a few times now, is why are there so few people engaged, right? And that's kind of a long story that we talked about a lot, and lots of thoughts about that. But one way one could try and approach that is to sort of understand the psychology of who gets engaged in action. Now, there is a kind of literature going back, decades on this, but there's almost no literature we discovered relevant to the climate crisis. The climate crisis is different from like preventing that company from polluting in your backyard, right? If there's a river where you live in Oregon and it's being polluted by that plant, it's not hard to see how you get together with people in the local community and you basically stop the thing from polluting, and then there's no pollution in the river and you won, it's finished, right? The problem with this, of course, this is a problem worldwide. And so, there are many characteristics of collective action campaigns that may have been gleaned from the social science literature that may not apply so well here. So I'm sort of on new territory. Anyway, all of it is to say, is we did our first study, which is a registered report, no less. This is an interesting comment for neuroscientists. I went my whole career with over 100 papers, and we never did a registered report. And the first paper I did in this new field was a registered report. So this is basically a registration of the key experiment plan hypotheses before the study was even run, that was given in principle acceptance by the reviewers, no matter how the data turned out, as long as though we adhered absolutely to the analysis we'd specified. So it's kind of a really powerful way to do social science research. So we're trying to sort of understand the psychology and the factors that go into how people, who gets involved in collective action and who becomes an activist. And if one can understand more about that, that might be useful in building great organizations. So if you're interested, you can look at the paper. I'm not really going to talk about it in a lot more detail, except to say that it didn't really work. I mean, it worked as a piece of science, but it didn't really work in the way that our experimental manipulation was not really capable of driving people to really join collective action the way we thought. And the main reason for that was that they were doing it for the money, right? These were some of the most, precarious and harassed and busy students at UCSD from lower income backgrounds that wanted to earn $100 by being in the study over 6 weeks. And they literally said, Professor, if you want us to join your collective action stuff or get involved, you need to pay us, which is kind of a good point. Whereas, of course, we see in the environmental movement, often the students and people there have somewhat more privilege, right? They're often from middle-class backgrounds and they have the time to be able to do this kind of thing. So going forward, the plan is now to do this kind of thing. And this gets to Fabian's question about scaling collective action in universities and making it much bigger everywhere, of simultaneously trying to understand the social science of collective action, the factors that drive people to be involved and measure that, but really to actually achieve it, right? I'm more interested in actually scaling up student activism in universities than I am necessarily in studying it, but I'm interested in studying it insofar as studying it will help that endeavor. It kind of works in both directions, right? So it's kind of a shift really for me in terms of my role as an academic now. I don't really want to produce papers in their own right. I want to produce papers that actually bear on the mission of creating more activism. So our thoughts on how to do this, and everyone is welcome to participate if you like, is like this. And this is pretty sketchy right now, and I don't have a lot of time to explain it all to you, and it's not well fleshed out, but something like this. We now start with, we don't just say, hey, who wants to be in a research study, and then you get paid, and then they come in and they discover it's about climate change. We explicitly go to people and say, would you like to be in a study that trains you how to be an activist on climate change, right, on the climate crisis? And we can go a little further where we are and actually recruit people we already know want to do that. They just didn't really get involved. So we can go a little further. So that's what I mean by recruit participants with high personal risk perception, people who actually already want to act. So they're primarily doing this because they want to be trained to be activists and organizers rather than for the money. We will basically measure a bunch of stuff about them, like how much collective action have they been involved. We don't want people already doing collective action. We don't want people to know how to do it, right? Dorit has got some ideas now about how to actually do it, right? We don't want her in our study. She's actually doing collective action already. So we want to make sure people are not really doing it, even if they want to. We can, before we start, measure a bunch of psychological factors about them, which is what we did in the study, collective efficacy, self-efficacy, theory of change, all these sorts of things I can elaborate. And then they're in an intervention. And the intervention's a kind of boot camp, right? They come to class on a Monday night, and it's not teaching them about the climate crisis. They already know we have a climate crisis. They actually want to do something about it. You don't have to tell them about greenhouse gas effect and all the rest of it. They're freaked out already. They're high on climate anxiety. So the boot camp is really going to teach them specifically, how do you deal with fossil energy on your campus? How do you deal with commercial banks? The fact that the campus is using Bank of America. How would you do a campaign to shift personal banking? How would you deal with food waste? How would you get involved in civic actions in your local community to increase ballot registration for transportation initiatives? How would you, blah, 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 right? There's a whole bunch of things they could learn how to do that are very specific, a kind of praxis. They will form groups. They will have homework exercises where they actually are supposed to engage with their group and actually achieving some of the collective action initiatives they talked about. And that will all be measured, right? There will be structured debriefs that characterize how people are feeling and their beliefs and reasons for doing and not doing as a function of which group they were in and not in. So there's a whole sort of idea about how to embed a social science research program in this. In the end, what we really care about is triggering more of them to be activists. But that is the idea, okay? And future plans. So we have interest from Santa Cruz, UCLA, somewhat University of Arizona, and somewhat Bristol University. There are people situated there who are interested in doing this and scaling this. The idea is to develop this fall, to develop the materials, the training materials and the methods, and then train trainers, right? So the person from Santa Cruz, the person from UCLA, the person from Arizona could be paid, right, to actually attend a kind of a trainer for trainers to actually do this. They then return and they run the boot camp in their institution. And there's a social science research program that's embedded in this whole thing, and this will be scaled around. But the main point is really to scale up the number of people with organizing skills for whatever they do in life. Now, maybe you're doing this kind of stuff already, but let me just say, I've realized by teaching this class for a few years that there's a huge gap between people having knowledge of collective action, actually knowing how to do it, right? So the students in my class, by the end of it, they all understand and write in their written responses, clearly recognize the significance of social mobilization and the need for it. But if I ask them questions about how would you do X, they have no idea, right? So for example, all the faculty in the system got to vote on whether to ask for fossil combustion to be reduced. But we've got a massive turnout at the 80% level and a strong yes. That would be much more significant than a 21% turnout. Getting more faculty to actually show that they cared by voting was a big, and we kind of failed in that way. We got a good yes vote, but we didn't get enough people to actually show that they cared, right? That's a collective action problem. How do you, I said to the students in my class after they went through all of this, how did you increase the number of faculty who actually would vote? I'll tell my professor to vote. I'll make a presentation to my professor's class. I'll ask my friend to tell her professor. That's about all they could come up with. Nobody said, let's right now form a group of 30 people in this room who want to work on this. Let's create an Excel spreadsheet of all the classes at UCSD with the names of all the professors. Let's check off exactly who's going to go to every single class and talk to every single professor. Let's connect the students at all the other 9 UCs and do the same thing with a massive spreadsheet with all the classes by 10 campuses. And let's hit everybody. And let's create a social media, TikTok, Twitter thing. Nobody said any of that because I don't think people know how to do that. This is a sort of skill set. And so this is really what I'm interested in doing, everyone. I'm going to stop rattling on here and welcome you. You know, if you're interested in being part of something like this and sort of doing a boot camp at your institution, and we're going to try and get funding to do this and support people, then do something about it. All right, I'm going to stop here and maybe, again, this is time for the general discussion, a little bit of time we have left.
Yeah, thank you so much, Adam, for everything. If people have questions, you can again just put them in the chat or raise your hand as before. And then we'll have a brief introduction to Scientist Rebellion and upcoming actions and how to get involved with that organization and civil disobedience group. Abi again, take it away.
Apologies for asking so many questions, but it's just you know, feel like I'm in a group of like-minded people. I read this excellent book. I think it's called Reinventing the Future, which sort of talks about collective movements. I mean, specifically, it takes the example of something like Occupy Wall Street, right? A huge movement happened in our lifetimes. Millions of people went to New York, occupied Wall Street, but then it kind of fizzled out. Nothing happened in the end. So how do we learn from this? How do we make a movement that's better? How do we, and specifically this book, you know, looks at that and compares that to the neoliberal movement, right? Which, you know, it traces back 50, 60, 70 years and looks at sort of how they were very calculatingly organized. So I guess my question is kind of a bit wandering by sort of getting towards this sense of, can we understand our enemy in the sense, which is, you know, fossil fuel industries, heavily funded, have lots of people thinking about strategies to try and crush anything that's climate focused? How can we organize ourselves well enough to try and combat that?
I mean, it's a bigger question about how to build a broader social mobilization and why is it so small. I mean, I think, look, I'm talking here about activisty things and doing collective action and organizing together in a sort of confrontational fashion, and that's not for everybody. So Rupert Reed, you know, formerly of Extinction Rebellion, so talks a lot about the moderate flank now. I have kind of mixed feelings about this whole thing, but I think all he means is that he's not saying we shouldn't have XR and we shouldn't have Scientist Rebellion, we shouldn't have these things. We should have those things, but let's not pretend that that alone is enough. I think when he says moderate flank, he means we need a much broader mobilization across all sectors of society. And I think that's correct. And recognizing that, you know, many people are never going to do these kinds of things. They're just not going to get together with their friends and family and start confronting fossil fuel interests, right? Like we might do. But they can do other kinds of things. The pediatricians amongst all doctors seem particularly sensitized. Perhaps it makes sense, like they work with young people. You know, if the American Pediatric Association would take a position on this, if they would create continuing medical education, actually equipping their pediatricians of how to speak to parents and children about the climate crisis, that would be huge. If the Architecture Association, if various guilds, like, you know, wherever you're situated in society, whatever career you have, you need people more aligned. We need people more aligned, and they need to get aligned both in shifting consciousness and awareness in hearts and minds, the transformational struggle, and they need to get aligned in when is it you pick up the phone? When do you send that email? Because if we could activate hundreds of thousands of people in the UC system and wider California, like the youth. You know, at a particular moment on that day, you need to make your voice heard right now in Sacramento. Shit is going to start happening really quickly. But that doesn't require people to kind of go in the streets and scream about climate justice. It requires them to be orchestrated together as part of a broader campaign that starts putting their voice together with a lot of other people. So if that answers your question, Abby, it's like, I don't know how we do that. I mean, I have there's a longer conversation, but that's the kind of thing that needs to start happening, a much greater orchestration. Yeah.
I think it's getting towards that sort of maybe forming a kind of a brain, a central unit that can sort of then activate these, you know, specific instances of large scale.
And there is some of that. I mean, we have some amazing coalitions here in San Diego and California with all the very small environmental justice orgs are kind of loosely connected together. And to some degree, they can, at certain moments, make their voice felt together. But it doesn't work as well as you'd expect. And I don't think it works nationally, although there's a little bit of that going on all the time. Even this bill reflects that to some extent. Yeah, Ilya, it would be great to develop a sort of how to mobilize your campus template based on successful experience. Yeah, I agree. That's a really cool idea. I mean, I'd love to work on something like that. I'm talking about a specific kind of how to train activists, but you're talking about a more general thing of like, here's a set of principles about how you mobilize your campus and how you get going. Yeah, and to maybe connect those all together in a bigger framework. I mean, I think the dynamic norm is important, right? Like students at, I don't know, Groningen in the Netherlands, right? They've got a big natural gas field there, by the way, but they may feel like we're too small and we're just one university and there's not a lot of us, and what does it matter? If those students felt that they were part of a broad network of universities throughout, say, you know, the Northern Hemisphere, right? Through these rich countries that actually work together, all together, sort of pulling in the same direction in a coordinated way that was growing, that would be much more motivating.
Any other questions, Dominic?
Yes, hi. So first of all, thank you very much for this fantastic talk. It's been very motivating. It's we're trying. I'm a student from Germany, and we're trying to build a similar movement right now at our university. And I'm wondering, what would you suggest as an strategy to talk to professors, teachers, and so on? Because right now we're only students, and so I'm wondering, because from a professor's perspective, they have a bit more, how to say, legitimation if they demand something from the university. So would you suggest that we take action first and count on the professors to reach out to us? Or should we talk to them first and try to build something up together to change it, like from the inside?
Yeah, great question. So that gets a little bit to Elia's question. Actually, I'm just putting in the chat here, Anna Castiglione, some of you may know her. So she's in Trento in Italy, and she's doing exactly, I think it was Dominic, she's doing exactly what you're asking right now. She's working with students at Trento to try and get something going and trying to recruit professors. So part of this is that Elia's point is right. We need some support network now across multiple institutions to help people do this. Simple answer to your question is professors are pretty useless. All right, I can say that with a lot of authority right now. The number who will actually join into this kind of stuff is tiny, right? We have about 5 at UCSD, but 5 amazing ones that are like the backbone, because students come and go. So having a few professors engaged, both because of what you talk about, the legitimization, they have a certain way of maybe being taken a little bit more seriously in some settings, not necessarily because the institutions care a lot about the students, but all I would say to you is there's going to be 3 or 4 profs in your institution that really care about this. You just have to find them. Don't expect it to be a lot, but I mean, when I say care about it, I mean to actually care enough to take the time to get into a grassroots group and start working on collective action and getting away from their ordinary activities will be very few, but there'll be some. So I encourage you, and also staff members, postdocs, and things like this.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions for Adam?
I think I got
Otherwise,
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
This was great. Thanks so much. Oh, there's a question from Gian.
Yes, sorry, maybe I'm taking up too much time, but yeah, I wanted to ask you to expand a little bit more on what you mentioned before, so that basically there are different categories of skepticism. And sometimes I wonder, I mean, I do social psychology as well. And, you know, in our experiments on cooperation, we tended to classify people in 3 different categories. Of course, it's very, very rough, but yeah, let me just go with it. So there are the selfish, the conditional cooperators, and the good Samaritans. So basically, you have no problems in involving the good Samaritans. So these are the pure altruists. They are really concerned with the common good. Selfish are much harder, impossible, I would say, unless you create the right incentives to get them engaged. Conditional cooperators are people who are prepared to cooperate as long as enough other people cooperate. So my question was, yeah, if you could expand a little bit on which different, in a way, strategy of communication should we use with the different people, and whether it makes sense at all to engage with the super skeptics, because sometimes I think, I mean, just forget about them. It's a waste of time.
Yeah, I mean, Catherine Hayhoe writes a lot about that, and Michael Mann as well. And their take, as I understand, is just don't waste any time with the serious skeptics now. It's just every second of your life you try and spend on that is a waste of time. So then maybe that's good advice. I guess it depends what skeptics you mean, right? So if people are skeptic about the human cause, yes. Some people are, except the human cause, they're skeptic about impacts. Maybe you should take some time. You know, I mean, not everyone understands about what's RCP 8.5 and 4. I mean, most of these IPCC pathways are kind of fantasies, right? And people don't realize how serious it is, and they've got this like 1.5C target keeping them asleep all the time, not understanding this is basically gone for now, right? So I think one way to answer your question is, people are impact skeptics, maybe it's worth taking some time. And certainly if people are response skeptics, that's where, you know, that's the way I think about this, right? Is that's maybe, you know, I know lots of response skeptics around me, right? And I just occasionally send them pieces of information. I just saw some news right now. I don't want to be like, sound like some kind of green capitalist booster, but obviously we do need more renewable energy. And so there was news today that there's a record set in California now for overnight supply by battery of electricity, right? So one of the challenges is we can run the state basically off renewable energy right now, almost entirely for many hours of the day, but at night you can't, so they're burning fossil fuels. Well, so the battery level has increased, right? So this guy keeps seeming to need evidence that things can move in the right direction, and that, you know, concerted efforts by multiple people are actually producing change. He was kind of encouraged recently that the city council had voted, right, to cancel all new electricity, all new gas lines in new buildings. And I explained to him that this is the result of a 10-year campaign by San Diego's 15 Climate Action Campaign. He's like, oh, okay. So, you know, his skepticism about it's all lost and there's nothing I can do and it's all pointless kind of drops when he's provided with evidence of how people working together are actually achieving stuff. He starts to seem a little bit more hopeful. So Gian, I think of the categories more to do with what kind of skeptic are you dealing with? What are they skeptic about? And then I think finally, just to say, you know, I don't think we should expect most people, even if they're in your Good Samaritan category. I mean, people are concerned with homelessness, people are concerned with other issues. And even the Good Samaritan types, they might just donate money, right? A lot of people will contribute in ways that are not sort of, you know, at the barricades, and that's okay. But we kind of want to galvanize them all to kind of contribute to something and to try and coordinate that. I'm not answering your question very well, I'm sorry. I think we should stop here though, because Fabian wants to do the scientist rebellion thing. So I'm going to thank you all. This is super engaging. I'm sorry I rattled on a little bit long and didn't quite know what to cover, but it seemed like maybe it was useful. So thank you. And I think Science Rebellion is great, and I'm happy to participate in it always and watch how it evolves.
Fantastic, Adam. Thanks for your time. And we'll definitely be in touch. I'd love to collaborate on and think about. Cool.
Thanks.
All right, then I will briefly talk about Scientist Rebellion, the motivation and upcoming actions and how I can get involved. And I want to keep this brief. I'm not going to talk about, you know, the scale of the emergency, the recent and ongoing extreme weather events, or the science that keeps coming out telling us it's worse than predicted. But I want to briefly touch on the science and policy interface, where we see really a failure of listening and a failure of communication of historic proportions. And there's one great example, the last sentence of the summary for policymakers of the Working Group 2 report of the recent IPCC report, saying that any further delay in concerted anticipatory global action on adaptation and mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. And this is a sentence for the history books, and all governments approved of it. Now, while these reports have become more stark in their language and more dire in the warnings they issue, they're nothing new. And so, the next graph almost breaks your heart, showing that we've, known about the problem for decades, convened about it in conference of the parties after conference of the parties, have written IPCC report after IPCC report. But in terms of global emissions, we've barely made a dent. And all the major greenhouse gases today are at record highs. And even now, in the era of loss and damage, where climate impacts are becoming more widespread and more severe, governments, influenced by fossil capital, are continuing on a path of destruction. And if they were serious about the climate crisis, as Fatih Birol said last year, the executive director of the International Energy Agency, if governments were serious about the climate crisis, then there can be no new investments in oil, gas, and coal, from last year on. However, governments actually plan to produce more than twice the amount of fossil fuels in 2030 that would be consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. So here we see coal, the production consistent with 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees, and the actual plans similarly for oil and gas. And this is really this failure of listening and this failure of communication of epic proportions, where the scientific community is screaming at policymakers over decades that we're in an emergency and we have to act, but governments continue on the path of destruction. And so here we are, in 2022, in the critical decade that will determine the future of our species, and we're running out of time. And so what we have to do, as academics, as scientists, we can't continue in our ivory towers, publishing these random papers in journals that are inaccessible to the wider public. But we have to engage we have to rethink the role of scientists and engage with how social change happens at a massive and urgent scale. And we can't continue with science as usual. And this is going to be a little bit difficult, right? It's not about retweeting something or flying to that conference, but it is really building grassroots movements and getting involved in these local struggles that is quite different from what academics are used to, but it is what is required in this moment. And if there is no struggle, there is no progress. It's always been like this. Power doesn't concede anything without a demand. It never did, and it never will. And so, as the social science and past struggles indicate, one way to force rapid change is through mass civil disobedience. And so Scientist Rebellion is not only a group that endorses mass civil disobedience, but engages in it. So it's a global movement of scientists and academics, from PhD students to full professors, who engage in civil disobedience. So who intently, publicly, consciously, peacefully, non-violently break certain aspects of the law to express that we're not standing by the destruction of the natural world, the destruction of our loves, of our love and dreams. And there's something powerful when senior scientists engage in this, and scientists more broadly, because they're the most trusted group in society, and they can kind of light a fire that breaks through this fourth wall and alerts the public to the emergency, but also supports other climate groups. And we're very, very well connected, and we are extremely privileged, in the academy. So we can understand these scientific reports, and with that understanding comes a responsibility. And so you might have heard about some actions we organized in April when the Working Group 3 report of the IPCC came out, and we mobilized over 1,000 scientists and academics in 28 countries who engaged in blocking of government ministries, corporations, paper pasting, academic strikes, occupations, teaching, street theater, adult humor, that led to mass arrest in multiple countries and in global press coverage. And it spawned, all these local scientist rebellion groups. So in the United States, in Canada, in South America, Africa, lots of them in Europe. So wherever you are, I encourage you to try to connect with your local scientist rebellion group, and if it doesn't exist, to start one. So these are engaging horizontally and independently, but there's also collaboration among those groups. So for autumn, what we have planned is to concentrate forces on a single country in Europe, in Germany, to engage in repeated actions there and to collaborate with many other civil disobedience groups. At the same time, we're organizing solidarity actions across the globe. And this is also kind of a precursor to our bigger COP actions, COP27. And this is going to be huge because it has to be huge. Because again, we are in the critical decade that will determine the future of our species. And we're at this juncture where we can choose to continue on the path of destruction or to avert destruction and move towards a more healthy, more equitable, more just society. And it's kind of maddening to be born into this moment, right? To witness what we are witnessing, to be alive at this critical moment. And there's a scene in The Lord of the Rings I think about a lot in this context. You may know it. It's Frodo who says, "I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened." And then Gandalf says, "So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us." And so I encourage you to get involved with local groups, get involved with Scientist Rebellion, and it's really involvement on all levels that is needed. So not only people, getting out there on the streets, risking arrest, but there's a lot of back office work, right? Organizing these talks, organizing social media, talking to reporters, doing mobilization. So all of that on all levels is required. So if you have any, regardless of your skills or your experience or your interests, you are absolutely needed in the struggle for a livable Earth. So please get involved. If you're representing a climate group, you can join the coalition calls that we have for our October actions. I'll share the slides with you afterwards. And if you're not particularly associated with any group, you're just an individual, please check out the links we've put in the chat so you can join us and get involved. With that, I thank you.